Another great game down the drain.
Early last year, we were blessed with the launch of Dead Space Remake, which many would argue is one of the best remakes ever made. It captured the original just so perfectly, honored the source material while modernizing and improving
Is this a shadow? Or is this like mustard or something?
on what needed to be improved, making it what many would consider to be the ultimate version of Dead Space. And the critical acclaim was just, all over the news. And it is something that many people thought would pave the road to Dead Space becoming just a more normalized IP, being something that EA would really lean into the future. But based on recent news, it looks like Dead Space is back on ice. So this news began to circulate when Jeff Grubb
Dead Space is probably back on ice because of one simple reason. It's a remastered, okay? Not that many people care about remasters in general. Second of all, that remaster was full of microtransactions. And, well, those probably didn't sell well now, did they? Yeah. So, EA is looking at it and saying, yeah, well, it probably sold decently, but the microtransactions, now those did not sell too well. We have already seen situations like this happen multiple times with other games, so this is nothing new.
took the giant bomb to share that he heard from sources that EA Motive
The hell is this?
was working on a Dead Space 2 remake, which was in concept phase but got canceled or shelved because of the lackluster sales of the first remake. They're now working on Iron Man and Battlefield. So apparently, Dead Space Remake, despite the acclaim, commercially speaking, I don't know if didn't do well is the right term for it. It's more that it didn't meet the corporate expectations that EA had for.
Yeah, Young. The corporations, bad. Executives, bad.
The game. They had a certain sales target based on the budget and how much money they wanted to make off of the game, and it didn't accomplish enough to make EA and the executives and the investors happy, or at least that's what Jeff Grubb is reporting here. Now, EA actually did respond to this news, this report, which is rare for them to do, but they felt the necessity to do so in this situation because they wanted to emphasize that they were never working on a Dead Space 2 remake. According to IGN, who reached out to EA about this, EA has denied reports that a Dead Space 2 remake was in development before being canceled, and the direct quote from EA reads as follows: "We don't normally comment on rumors, but there is no validity to this story." Now, Jeff Grubb responded by saying that this is typical corporate denial. He posted, "I give you my permission to believe EA if you want, but whenever a company says that isn't true, but they don't specify which part of the story they are talking about."
I'm pretty sure they honestly specified every part of that isn't true from what we saw right here.
Well, yeah. Dead Space 2 was definitely being planned. It had a code name, and they aren't making it now. Now, further clarification was provided.
Well, to be absolutely fair, you probably always plan for a continuation of the sequel, and account that this may happen if the other things don't happen. So, did they have a code name for Dead Space 2? Probably. Did they think that this could be maybe done? Probably. But it most likely never got off, any launch pad at all. It was just, they decided, yeah, we could do Dead Space 2, but that was probably the only decision that they made.
By Jason Schreier, who did his own investigation, and according to him, based on the sources that he reached out to, people familiar with the project tell Bloomberg that EA's statement is correct, meaning that Dead Space 2 Remake was never officially in development. Jason Schreier published a whole article about this, reporting his investigation in greater detail. It reads right here that Electronic Arts has put Dead Space on ice for the second time, the first time being after Dead Space 3 flopped. The Dead Space remake seemed to indicate interest in revitalizing the series and sort of making it a marquee part of EA's portfolio moving forward. but it looks like EA has changed their mind on that front despite the critical acclaim of Dead Space, and that has to do with lower than expected sales. It would seem as though that aspect of Jeff Grubb's report is true. Jason Schreier corroborates that sales of the remake.
Dude, I don't need any sources to know that that's true. Do you think EA is just gonna not make a sequel to a game if it sells well and there's money to be made? Hell no, they're making a sequel 100%. Maybe not now, but definitely at some point. The only reason why they would not make a new Dead Space, or, something along Dead Space lines, is if it wasn't making enough money, and that's pretty much it.
Missed the company's expectations, and so that derailed any chances of a new Dead Space game. Scrapping any kind of development for a future Dead Space game, be it a brand new entry or a Dead Space 2 remake, that was a decision that was seemingly made early last spring, so that'd be shortly, just a few months after the Dead Space remake launched, which would mean that it didn't take long after launch for EA to see that sales of Dead Space remake would not meet the financial quotas.
Yes. Do you know what interesting about sales? Honestly, you can tell if the sales are gonna reach your quotas very early on. I'm talking about literally less than a week, okay? Day one, and you already have an indicator, are the sales strong or not? Because you already have expectations from previous games that you have done when they're successful and then when they're not successful. Because you can see it, okay? If day one, for example, something sells 10,000 units, and your previous expectations for similar things is like 20,000 units, then you know that it's probably going to underperform unless your expectations for this were way lower than average. So yeah, you can tell if something's going to succeed or not pretty much in less than 1 week of sales. 3 days of sales, and you can already correctly guess what's going to happen.
That they were expecting, and so it was a pretty quick decision to call it quit on Dead Space as a whole, for now at least. Now, there are no official sales reports on Dead Space Remake's financial performance, but you can kind of...
Wow. All-time peak. 29K, not even. Oof, that's a bit painful, not gonna lie. Yeah, this is like a Suicide Squad level of not really my cup of tea, huh?
Gauge numbers based on Steam all-time peak concurrent players. If you look at Dead Space Remake's all-time peak performance on Steam, you can see that number is sitting at 28,842 players, which is about a fourth of what, say, something like Resident Evil 4 Remake accomplished, which reached an all-time peak concurrent players number of 111,172 players, according to Steam charts. And when we
also, there was a lot of hype about the Resident Evil remake. When the Dead Space remake came out, I don't remember people honestly speaking that much about it. I remember hearing here and there, it's like, oh, there's a remake, it's pretty good. But then I heard about the microtransactions, and that's pretty much it. That's where it stopped.
We consider that Resident Evil 4 Remake has sold over 7 million copies as of March of 2024. Perhaps it's a safe assumption to expect that Dead Space did about a fourth of that number.
2 million, judging by these numbers. 2 million, 2.2 million.
Since its all-time peak concurrent players is a fourth of that of Resident Evil 4. And so Dead Space sales might be sitting sort of in the area of less than 2 million copies total since launch. This is a very rough estimate. These numbers are not official, but things like Steam charts are a bit of an indicator as to how well a game might be performing commercially. So assuming that Dead Space Remake sold somewhere between 1 and 2 million units, maybe on the higher end of...
By the way, I'm just saying this, but in reality, if I was seriously looking into this, I would never compare just blatantly Dead Space numbers to Resident Evil numbers if I actually wanted a serious gauge. I would actually compare the Dead Space Remake numbers to the original releases of the game and the numbers that we know there, and then I would compare them to the Resident Evil remake numbers. That's how I would do it. Because just comparing this with Resident Evil, if I was working and someone said, yeah, I do this, I would look at them and fucking say, are you retarded? unironically, by the way, unironically, that's like just a life tip. You know, if you want to be any kind of analyst or whatever, you need to understand which numbers are comparable at which point and where you need actually a little bit more. So, yeah.
The 1 million, that may not be such a far-fetched assumption. Now, selling almost 2 million copies of anything is still good, but at a AAA level, at a AAA scale, we're dealing with, multi-billion-dollar companies like EA. They're looking for greater results than that. Even around launch time,
they're not really looking for greater results, honestly. They're just looking for profitability in future. Again, I don't think this is just, oh, the game didn't sell good. I think this is the microtransactions plus the game didn't sell good. Because, I don't know, maybe it's worth, because you can downscale a remake if you want. There's no problem with it. So, you downscale your remake, make it a little bit less fancy and blah, 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 and suddenly it's worth it. That's how this goes. But, again, I think the real deal here is that the microtransactions of Dead Space Remake didn't sell well. And that is the real thing.
We were seeing some hints that Dead Space Remake might not be selling super gangbusters. So, for example, here's an article from January 30th, 2023 that details how while Dead Space Remake did launch at #1 in UK box charts, those numbers were ultimately lower than those of Callisto.
UK? Yeah, everyone cares so much.
Protocols. So already there were hints that Dead Space wasn't gaining the momentum that it needed for it to sell enough copies to please the EA executives to greenlight another Dead Space project. Now, apparently, while Jeff Grubb was wrong in saying that Dead Space 2 Remake was in the works before it got canceled and shelved, that doesn't mean the possibility of remaking Dead Space 2 wasn't discussed. It's just that it never made it to the table.
Yeah, of course. It was discussed. I think there has been a discussion for literally every game that EA owns to have a sequel, have a continuation, have a remake. I think every game that EA has had this discussion, and they're just putting them at what they value as in probably going to be more beneficial. It's that simple.
On any official capacity, as Jason Schreier details here. Yes, Dead Space is now on ice once again. EA's Motive explored ideas for a new entry early last year, but none were greenlit. The chief hope was for a new game, not a remake of Dead Space 2, despite today's rumors, although both ideas were explored. But talking about ideas and gauging what a studio might potentially want to do for their next project is one thing. It's another thing for it to be in official development, which is what Jeff Grubb was claiming, and Dead Space Remake 2 was never officially in development. It was just sort of rumbling.
You know how this person, Jeff Grubb, is wrong and bad? Because this is the people that he associates with. And again, always judge a book by its cover.
On next, hence the confusion. Might have confused. It's just sort of rumblings and ideas that the developers had in mind that never ultimately panned out in any solid form. Jason Schreier further explained a potential reason for why Jeff Grubb might have confused his information, saying that Motive used the same codename to describe whatever project that the Dead Space team was working on next, hence the confusion on Jeff's part. It was never really a Dead Space 2 remake, and for nearly a year, it's had nothing to do with Dead Space. So it's not always the case that a specific codename is given to a specific project. Sometimes there's just a codename that represents any next project that might occupy the space of that codename. And so while Dead Space 2 rumblings were there behind the scenes, the thing that ultimately got the codename that Jeff Grubb confused with for an official Dead Space 2 remake development is whatever it is they're working on now that they've been working on for nearly a year. Currently, we know that Motive is working on 2 new games, the Iron Man project and a new Battlefield game. And in fact, Jason Schreier further highlighted that the leadership team that was responsible for the Dead Space remake is now focused on Battlefield, which for EA tends to be a more profitable venture. So
wow, really? Who would have expected? Anyway, that's pretty much it.
And discussions. Stay tuned here on Young Yeah.
Young Yeah.
I'll see you guys
next time. Young Out. Yeah. Anyway, this was Citizen, and that was Young Yeah, as you could probably tell. And have a nice day. Bye-bye.